Good morning, James Ramuzzi with Sustainable Solutions. I wonder if the panel might speak to how you guys dealt with a constituency that may not look favorably onto cutting trees and using herbicides and kind of these disturbance-driven management activities.
Please take the microphone if you're going to.
Thank you.
Just pass it down the line.
Sure.
Yeah, the constituencies on all these landscapes have been addressed through walks, presentations at night, going out of our way to make sure that I had to work while you were talking was not an excuse for hearing about this. So everything we did was treated as though the public had a stake in it. And so there was newspaper articles and things of that nature. That doesn't mean there still wasn't an outcry about, Mr. Simmons, what do you have against those trees? There's just too many of them, and they were too dangerous. So we continued up until I left a year ago to bring the public out to these sites at their peak of their performance, which is May now, when the birds are doing their thing, and show them what was happening, and show them also that we had taken the risk out of their backyards.
And I'll just reiterate what Tim said. We did a lot of the same. You saw the signs, but we were going out to neighborhood associations ahead of time. All the various ways you can reach people. Social media, so Facebook, Twitter, our website. But really trying to be proactive and going out and talking to people repeatedly before we actually did any of the work. And as Tim said, you can please some of the people some of the time. But it's funny, after a year, 15, 20 years of doing prescribed fire in this landscape, we get very, very few phone calls. Maybe, if you lose the heat at the end of the burn and your column, the smoke dissipates, a few people will get some smoke in their backyard, and you might hear from a couple. We got so many more phone calls for cutting trees than we have ever received for putting fire on the ground. And it was an educational process. And ultimately, 9 times out of 10, so I ran into a couple 2 days ago with Stephen Pine with visiting the preserve. We were in Panera. We had our logos and whatnot on. Are you those people that were in the paper about cutting trees? And she seemed concerned about it. I was like, okay, where's this going to go? Had a simple conversation with her and explained, basically fuels and wildlife in a nutshell. And that's the other thing for us, is keeping the messaging really simple, keeping the signs simple. It can be a really complicated story, and if you're that knowledgeable, interested group I mentioned, who really wants all that detail, you can get into it. But for the public at large, one of the things that audience development plan and that consultant helped us appreciate is that their constituency engagement is about figuring out who you are and how you relate to what we want to do, and then communicating to you in a way that you can connect with, versus us just telling you, no matter who you are, the same story over and over again. So for us, keeping the message simple and keeping the imagery pretty simple helped a lot. And it wasn't a 30-second conversation in Panera. That's great. I love what you guys are doing. Seriously. And that happens over and over and over again. The biggest obstacle in my 20-some-odd year experience in dealing with the public is fear as a mind killer. And we think they're going to respond in a certain way, so we decide not to engage. And as a state agency or a quasi-state agency, we have, to some degree, we can do what we need to do or mandated to do on that landscape. We don't have to necessarily connect with people, but it's so much easier if you do. And what we've found is that by being proactive and connecting with people, 9 times out of 10, that's the response you get. Oh, thanks for explaining that. That's great. I see a locust clone cleared. That's not a shopping mall going in. That's not another development. That's us. That's conservation. That's what conservation looks like. That's creating wildlife habitat, reducing fuels, making your neighborhood safer. And that message seems to resonate. But no matter who we're talking to, it's almost always the fundamental common denominator is wildlife and wildfire risk reduction.
I'm old enough so that I'm of an era when I was in forestry school, and my family owns a tree farm in northern Minnesota, and I experienced it directly with the forester I worked with there. We were taught to hide, in this case, timber cutting. Couldn't cut within a chain of a road and things like that. You had to have a buffer strip. And it's not as easy to hide smoke, which goes up in the air. I mean, you see it for miles, even on a small burn. I have one example that I think demonstrates how we dealt directly with an anticipated problem. When we started burning at Montague, the area that Tim talked about, it was 2000, 2001. We only had one neighbor, and he was right across the street, he and she, the Kosinskis. And for better or for worse, we chose to mobilize and have our briefing. Basically, the street was a kind of a dirt road, and there was nobody else for a quarter of a mile along there. So they had this nice little enclave out in the middle of the Barrens, and all of a sudden, all these fire trucks and UMass students and people with drip torches showed up. And I anticipated that because I'm sort of paranoid anyway. I was an air controller when I was in the Navy and ran a group of freightermen that had to talk to ships and submarines and things. And my father was a carrier pilot at the end of World War II. So I anticipated this sort of thing, and I took one of my graduate students who was a qualified burn boss with the TNC before she came to grad school. She actually worked in Massachusetts TNC as a fire manager for a brief time. And I said, Julie, you know, we're going to be right in front of the Kosinski's house, and they'll be there. And I would like you not to be out there teaching students how to light fire or anything else. If we have any problems or they have any questions, I want you to be there to answer them. And we had our briefing, and they were there, and they were sort of looking at us, and we started going. We got the drip torches out, and Julie was over there, and she was talking to them, and she was the right person for the job. I would not have been the right person. I would have lectured them for 2 hours, and they would have gone away in a fog. And somewhere along the line, when it was getting a little hot, I looked over, and I saw all this pile of stuff in the front yard and a tarp, and so I sort of sideways over to Julie, and I said, what are they doing? He said, they think you're going to burn down their house. Well, we didn't burn down the house, and we had a after-action review literally right in the road in the front of their house. There's no traffic. And about halfway through, they came out and asked us if we wanted any Sprite or water or anything, and they stood there and listened to our after-action review. And I would say since then, I would call them up every time we burned out there the day before. If they weren't home, I would go and knock on the door to see if they were, you know, awake or not. I eventually got to the point where I said, we're going to be burning in this area over here. Let us know. This is my cell phone. If there's any smoke, you know, we'll quit and go somewhere else or shut down for the day. But I would say within a year, they were just absolutely overjoyed with the amount of blueberries, turkeys, deer, whippoorwills, whatever. And in all the time that for the next 10 years that I burned there, I don't think we had a single complaint from them. Like Tim didn't say that I was wrong or not, but this was a case where, you know, you didn't write anything in the paper. You were dealing with one person who, if they didn't like what they were doing, they would shut you down with their complaints. And who would not sympathize with them? You know, we have smoke in our house all the time, every time they're out there, you know. But we dealt with them one-on-one. And Neil has to do that with 2,000 people.
Hundreds every day. Every day we burn, we call between 50 and 200 people. We call a lot, and we do, to answer your question, direct mailing is really important to us. And we just started this new thing called Chat with Staff Hour. It's kind of like coffee talk. Remember that from Saturday Night Live? But the idea is basically 4 times a year, we direct mail, let people know about this and all the work that we're planning on doing, and invite them in to sit down like this. No presentation, no agenda. What do you want to talk to us about regarding the preserve? And we've had 2 of those now, and they've gone really, really well. And you would think all the disgruntled people would be the ones showing up. It's quite the opposite, actually. It's mostly the people that already know something and want to know more. Direct mailing is important.
Great question and great answers. Other questions?
Dick Camper, the Long Island Pine Barrens Society. Nothing happens on Long Island without a campaign. There's 3 million people, and you can't just go door to door. I wonder if any of you have had any experience with Long Island or can perceive how Long Island is different from some other place. What would be the 5 elements that would be most likely to produce broad-based public support and political support for burning in the Pine Barrens of Long Island?
I can speak just briefly. I haven't done a lot of burning here. The first burn that we did out on Fire Island, it was not an issue because we were way out at Sailor's Haven or someplace that the public was not there. But before they first started to burn, or even wanted to burn, they being the TNC and their cooperators, at the Hempstead Plains, I remember they had me come down and give a talk, and there were a lot of people there, and it was just a very general talk. It was somewhere in the 1980s, I think. But that was a place to start, and I've been in other places where there's been very strong opposition to the National Guard doing things at Camp Edwards, and they would have big open meetings, and they would let anybody come, and I've been called everything from whatever I was called here today, some icon who knows a lot but doesn't know a lot, to basically just a pawn of the Department of Defense because I'm getting paid by it. And I learned very early on I was not getting paid, and I learned not to get paid. So now I'm teaching students at UMass, probably because they wouldn't have the course anyway, but I do it on a volunteer basis. All I ask for is a TA, and that TA has to be a wildland firefighter who's worked out west or someplace, because that's what I haven't done. And so I've dealt with 1,500 students in that class, many graduate students, and somebody like Steve Pine comes in and he says, I have to talk to you because everywhere I go, I run into your students. 2 chief fire wardens up for the state, You build up over a period of time a constituency recognizing there's some people that are going to be opposed to whatever you do whenever you do it. And you just can't deal with those, but this is not a aristocracy or a totalitarian state. You try and get a majority of the intelligent people who are willing to think about something to do it, and then take your chances. And if you can't convince them, then you probably say, well, we're not quite doing it right.
And I've burned down here, and I've worked with TNC and other folks on Long Island for a long time. But I'm not going to pretend to fully understand the complex politics and communities that you have down here. But I think Albany is somewhat analogous in that we have multiple municipalities, nearly a dozen fire departments. And for us, it was starting off slow and starting off small with demonstrations, real small demonstration burns, real small cuttings to demonstrate what we wanted to do, why we wanted to do it. We preempted those with presentations and talks and public hearings and all of that kind of thing. Like you say, much like a campaign, but simultaneously utilizing social, particularly today, websites, social media, all of that, basically like a campaign, particularly like a political campaign, but doing a full court press in a proactive, non-confrontational, friendly way to help people understand what you want to do and why, and then demonstrate on a small scale that you can do that safely and produce results. And I think you've already got plenty of examples already on Long Island of where you can produce results. If we had a market down here for the wood, I think it would be a lot easier. And build off of small successes to build a program. I would not suggest letting people know that you want to burn 10,000 acres or 50,000 acres of the Central Pine Barrens out of the gate. But let them know, you want to do a demonstration burn of 5 acres or 10 acres or 25 acres or a series of small burns. And I think you would be able to get the media attention in particular to help generate additional kind of advertising and support to get that buy-in. Ultimately for us, we realize we're never going to please everybody, but as long as we can have the vast majority of the public understanding what we're doing, and I borrowed, and we borrowed a paradigm from the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, who are doing a lot of timber cutting for the Young Forest Program. Support is great, but when you're managing state or public land, you don't necessarily need support, you need informed consent, which is a different paradigm. I don't need folks to come out and tell me or tell us that they support what we're doing. We simply need them not to oppose it. And understanding that paradigm when it comes, at least for public land, and I don't know private land if it's different. It's a slightly different paradigm, and it's enabled us to put forward a campaign of keeping people informed. And that's the other part of a campaign, I guess, is keeping it constant and dynamic. And that's the beauty of social media, that you can let people know what's going on. We're cutting today. But also following up, if you're doing demonstration burns or demonstration cuts this year, for God's sakes, follow that up next year and the year after with tours. And we lead tours not just for the public. We have the board and we have a technical committee. The technical committee meets monthly. The board meets quarterly. And every year we get those folks out to look at what we've done over the last year. So we tour burns, we tour cuts, high-quality Barrens, all of that, to keep them, and for us, our board is our politicians. So to keep them literally plugged in and with their finger on the pulse of not just what we're doing, but they've seen it. And the beauty of that is, for us, those politicians, so the most disgruntled people, they don't call us. They call their elected official because they think they can manipulate our funding. So if that elected official who doesn't need to know a whole lot, but knows enough that they have staff on board to say, yep, that's the commission, they're doing that for wildlife and wildfire risk reduction, you should talk to them, which happens over and over again. That's a win. So those people call their elected officials, and the elected official said, talk to the commission, they know what they're doing. That's huge. And so if you're looking at what I think you want to be able to do on Long Island long-term, and I think taking that campaign approach and starting off small and building off of your small successes, I think you'll find success. I hope that answered your question.
I can't add a whole lot to that. That campaign has to be carefully planned. And executed, and identify the nodes in those communities that speak volumes to their neighbors. Involved in a campaign to return fire to Cape Ann in Gloucester, Northeast Massachusetts right now, and we're bringing everybody into this, artists, poets, musicians, local firefighters, local fire chiefs. If you can't turn the fire chiefs, then you're not going to turn anybody. And at least 3 towns, the quote from the fire chief when we mentioned it to him was, "Over my dead body." And some of them are our greatest supporters now because they saw what the small increments could do for the larger good for the public.
Great question. We have another question down here, I think. Pat, I think he was up before Alex, sorry.
Scott Campbell, Suffolk County Health Department. It would seem to me that most people in the East End, especially, are more apt to approve of a dormant fire versus an active growing season fire. Visions of Bambi, running away from the fire, and also tourism, to have that huge plume go across the East End. They see that in June. It's a lot different than March. Impact on wildlife, things like that, if you could address that, and your thinking versus dormant versus active growing.
Well, the air quality issues that appear also with your tourist season they coincide. Our greatest ozone challenges and particulates occur in that summer season too. So there was a lot of resistance, even from our regulators, to do anything that would impact the local economy by doing growing season fires. So we crept up on that. And the wildlife question, we just have so many incidents of positive outcomes. One of those aerial ignitions that Bill mentioned at the Camp Edwards out on the Cape, 15,000 acre property. They took us up in helicopters, and we watched and filmed the deer herds just walking around as if nothing was happening. They'd been around this for thousands of years, but Bambi did a lot of damage, there's no question. And reversing that takes a lot of hand-holding and saying, no, that's not what's going to happen. But I won't go as far as say there's no mortality ever from these fires. There is, but it's not near as catastrophic to the wildlife community as people think it is. Things go underground. We had public, people for the ethical treatment of animals come out on our first burns with dogs that could sense metal voles. And they brought us bones of metal voles that had died by natural causes, but they didn't know that. They thought we had burned all the flesh and bones off of these. So we had to educate them as well.
That's a great question, and I would never say, and I've never said, even when I'm asked point blank, no matter how confrontational the interaction is, that there's no impact to wildlife, because there is. But for so many of these species, and I use a carner frequently as an example, because no life stage of the carner, so many of these species need fire. So and the carner is a good example because no life stage of carners can survive fire, but carners only live in places that burn frequently. So part of my response when I'm talking to people about impacts to wildlife, I won't say that there are no impacts, but we take a number of measures to minimize the impacts. And one of them is, the size of the area that we're burning relative to the size of the habitat. And for us, again, in the case of carners, with our permit, and we do this, you saw how fragmented the preserve is. It's kind of these individual sections. So we have a rule where we won't burn more than a third of an area in a given year, and we don't burn adjacent thirds in consecutive years. So that way we always ensure there's adequate refugia. So yes, as Tim suggested, most of the wildlife have adaptations to deal with fire, either going underground, flying away, walking away. And the habitat that regenerates post-fire is actually better for them. But for us, being so fragmented, we have to make sure that we're always leaving refugia. But that's an important part of the conversation that we have with people is that, yeah, there are probably going to be some impacts on wildlife. But in the end, as managers, you have to be careful who I say this to. As a wildlife manager, I'm managing wildlife populations. I'm not managing individual animals. So I may kill 500 or 1,000 carner blues with my burn, but in doing so, I'm able to keep that population going in the thousands over the long term. But again, with the general public, it's hard to, particularly now, increasingly so, it's hard for them to separate an individual from a population, but as managers, that's what we're doing. We're managing wildlife populations. But in the end, you're creating better habitat for many of the species that people care about.
Definitely, I learned that you had to scale down size. That was when we were burning hundreds of acres. It became impractical even in the dormant season. I never would have considered doing that in the growing season, even if the state would have allowed it. You have to watch the drought index very carefully, and you can drastically reduce the long-term smoke emissions from a unit down to a few hours, as opposed to, I know people who burn 20 acres in New Hampshire, and they smoked out towns for 2 weeks because it was dry as a bone. You just can't do that. People say, well, can I burn when the drought index is 500? I said, well, yeah, if you're willing to only burn a half acre. So you have to scale down. And finally, from just a control standpoint, to emphasize something that I think Neil said, and maybe it was last night, but rates of spread of growing season burns are 1/10 of what they are in dormant season burns, or way less than that, 100th. So if there are animals out there who generally know how to get away from something, they've got a much better chance of getting away from a growing season burn than they do a dormant season burn. I mean, when you're burning 15 acres a minute, like the Miles Standish fire, outfly, outrun, outdig, you just can't get away from that. But when you've got the same area burning in the middle of June or July, and you don't have this fire going into the soil, so you'll have burning and smoke for a long time. Even I at 72 years old, I could walk away from there. It's dramatic how much slower the fires are. And a lot of the smoke that goes up is white smoke. That's water vapor. It's gone. It's the black smoke that you have to watch out for. And some species produce more of that than others, and you learn to control that.
And I just want to follow up, reiterating that with our mechanical treatments in the growing season, the smoke is a non-issue because the heat generated from the slash pushes that stuff up and away. It's crazy to see it. We're burning under light and variable winds. But all of that mowing slash produces so much heat that it lifts the smoke in a way that we don't see in the dormant season. And granted, burning in the Barrens without mowing and creating that slash is probably a totally different story. But where we are doing the mechanical pretreatments first in our scrub oak thickets, and then burning them in the growing season, smoke management is so much easier.